Hello AP Bio. In this video, I'm going to introduce our next unit of study. We're going to be studying, in Unit 2, we're going to be studying cell structure and function. So we're studying cells. And the first thing I want to do is put it into context of where we just came from. So this diagram right here shows us the scale of some different organisms, some different things, I guess you could call them, that we can observe. And in Unit 1, this is what we studied right here. Unit 1 was biochemistry, and we studied this. And if you look at the bottom of this, this diagram right here, the drawings are not to scale, but this gives you a scale on the bottom. It's showing you, it goes from 0.1 nanometer, which is eeny weeny, to 1 meter, which is, you can see an adult human right here, females, a little bit larger than 1 meter. So going back down and just going through what we studied, you can see the sizes of atoms here. And then we went after atoms, we put them together into molecules, and we talked about the different classes of macromolecules. The lipids were the smallest, and then we went up to the proteins. And then we put some things together, and then we talked a little bit about viruses. Here's the flu virus. We also talked about Ebola. Ebola was 80 nanometers, and if we were to put that on here, that's just a little bit smaller than the flu. We talked a little bit about HIV. HIV is, the flu at 100 nanometers is a little bit smaller. HIV is 120 nanometers. And then the virus right now that's causing the pandemic, SARS-CoV-2, is a little bit bigger than that at 140 nanometers. So that's going to come in here. Now, if we look down here, what this diagram is showing us at the bottom is how we see, how we can observe some of the different phenomena that is shown in the diagram. And it's showing us here that the things that we've looked at so far can only be seen with the electron microscope. Now, you can see that there's some overlap. The next imaging technology is the light microscope, and that's where we can start to image things actually in the classroom. Right here is where we're going to be able to use a microscope called a light microscope that you may or may not have already used to observe cells and to look at cell structure, and then to talk about cell function that you'll see is variable based on the tons of different types of cell structures. Now, it's important to note about this light microscope here. This tool was a sort of a primitive microscope, was first introduced or invented in the early 1800s, and it really changed the field of study of biology. It is one of the most powerful tools that has allowed us to discover all sorts of information, observe all sorts of things that we can't observe with the naked eye. Because here, this diagram is showing us this is what we can see with the naked eye. We can't see cells. So we wouldn't be able to see the cell, which is the basic unit of structure and function of all of living organisms, without the use of microscopes. So it's definitely worth it. Let's write that down. That our knowledge and our understanding of the concepts that we study in biology, or just of the basic unit of living organisms, the cell, really results from using the compound microscope. Now, we call it, I'm interchangeably using the term compound microscope and light microscope. It actually technically is compound because it's more than one lens. Light, because it uses light microscope. And that's what we're going to use in class. The cell theory explains this idea now that we take for granted, which is that all living organisms are composed of cells. Now we say, like, oh, duh. But that was published back in 1830, I think, a long time ago. The cell theory explains other phenomena associated with our fundamental understanding of biology. For example, it states that all living cells come from pre-existing cells. It states that the cell is the fundamental unit of structure and function of all living organisms, that the activity and what an organism can do depends on the activity of independent cells. If you take a moment and you put your hand over your heart is beating, but it really is the action of many, many, many cells contracting and relaxing in unison. And that is possible because energy flows through cells, and the both metabolism, so process, and biochemistry occurs within cells. So all those reactions are happening. Added on to the original cell theory was our idea of genetics, that all cells contain DNA that's found in chromosomes, and that information is delivered and transferred by the molecule RNA. We'll spend a lot of time talking about that later on in the year. And then also connecting to our Unit 1, our study in Unit 1, all cells have basically the same chemical composition. If we look at organisms in similar species, which is interesting, evolutionarily interesting. Now, all living organisms are composed of cells, but that makes it oversimplifies it, because really there is a tremendous variety of structures. And you can see them here in these diagrams. This right here doesn't look anything like this right here, and it doesn't look anything like there. These are all different types of cells or different varieties of structures of cells. Therefore, just like when, the theme in biochemistry, where we have structure impacting function, we have all these structures, and therefore we have many different specialized functions. And you can tell many times looking at a particular cell what its specialized function is. Like, for example, these are the lining of your lung here, your bronchi inside your lungs. And if you take a really deep breath and then slowly let it out, that's interface right here, the lining of your lungs. So this is where the air is coming in here, and then this is the lining, and you can see this right here. These are all these really thin projections of the plasma membrane. It increases surface area tremendously, because the function of these, the variable function, the specialized function, is gas exchange. And just like when all the toll booths are closed except one, it slows traffic down. When you have all the toll booths open here, it's going to increase traffic. So you get faster gas exchange, which is allows reactions to go faster because you have more materials, and it gets rid of waste faster because gas is going both ways, the gas that you need and the gas that you want to get rid of. Now this cell, the cell in the middle, is a nerve cell. It's called a neuron, and we'll talk about that when we talk about cell communication. But if you look at it, you can see this cell even looks like it's specialized for communication. And it is. It collects sensory information over here. It receives information. That information is sent down this long part of the neuron. It's called the axon. And then it's then sent along to the next cell here from the axon terminal. We'll talk all about that when we talk about the nervous system. Now these cells right here, there's 3 different kinds of cells, but they're all blood cells. And blood cells, even within this blood, which is a liquid connective tissue, there are different functions. For example, red blood cells are responsible for delivering oxygen and cleaning up carbon dioxide. Platelets are responsible for growth and repair. Platelets. And signaling for new cell growth when there's been, or for renewal. We'll talk about platelet-derived growth factor. Here, this right here is another type of blood cell. It's called a white blood cell, and it's involved with protection. So even in the blood cells, there are different functions and different structures that therefore have different functions. Now, even with all this tremendous variability in cells, all cells have to be able to do certain things. So cells have to have specific functions. And because functions are related to structure, they have certain things certain parts that they have to have. So you can think of them as certain parts that are needed for proper function. That's what we call anatomy. So we're going to talk about cell anatomy quite a bit in this unit. And the anatomy that allows for the function, we call that physiology. So physiology is what the specific function is. Now, the basic components that all cells have to have, there's actually only 4 really foundational or fundamental components that all cells have to have. First of all, they have to have a plasma membrane. And the plasma membrane is a synonym with cell membrane, but the plasma membrane really is just a cell boundary. It's the thing that contains the cell. It's the difference between what is cell and what isn't cell. The inside, on the inside of the cell membrane, or the outside, which is with the environment. Cells also have to have something called cytosol. And the cytosol is an aqueous solution, very, very thick, viscous solution that's going to hold cell materials and then also the machinery that does all the cell jobs. So we'll just call it machinery because different cells are going to have different types of we'll call them subcellular components. You probably have heard of organelles before. So some subcellular components are organelles. Not all of them are considered organelles. The third component that all cells have to have are chromosomes. And chromosomes, that is just genetic material. So that chromosomes are made out of DNA and proteins. And we'll talk a lot about proteins plus DNA. And you've got chromosomes in all of your cells in your whole body. And all organisms, all cells have chromosomes. Every kind of cell on the whole planet. The fourth thing that cells have to have is because proteins are the molecule that is going to be the structure, it's going to drive process, it's going to be part of how cells talk to one another. All cells have to be able to make proteins, and the cellular component that is the protein maker is called a ribosome. So all cells must have ribosomes because all cells have to be able to synthesize proteins. Now, ribosomes technically don't synthesize proteins because they only put together the primary structure. So remember, before we had a functioning protein, we called that a polypeptide. So they really synthesize polypeptides. Now, that's all the things that cells have. The reason that they have to have them is because they have to do certain things. So the question is, what are the next thing I want to talk about is what the functions are. Well, I'm going to divide the functions of what cells need to do into sort of these groups of functions to think about them as cell systems. And there needs to be a system that processes information. There needs to be a system that processes matter. Cells need to be able to process energy. And cells need to be able to, where all this stuff is happening, they actually have to be able to provide the space, or you can think about it as the structure for all this to happen. Now, this is what all cells need to do. Some cells actually are specialized for communication. Specialized cells, that's their job, like this guy up here, the neuron. And some cells, not all cells, have to be able to reproduce. Now, all of these functions that have to happen have these, like I said, you can think of them as systems that are going to carry out the functions. And that's how we're going to look at the inner workings of a cell. We're going to look at them in systems. So we'll look at all the components that process information. We'll look at all the components that work together to process matter. We'll look at all the components that work together to process energy, and so on and so forth. And that's how we'll give ourselves a tour of the cell. Okay, that's it for now. And we're going to learn how to use a light microscope, the proper way to use a light microscope. And then we're also using the light microscope, we're going to explore different